So this week I thought we'd talk a little bit about atmospheric perspective. I had a couple questions. This sort of builds out of what I did last week, which was line drawing. And a lot of my line drawing and the line weight that I was applying was based on atmospheric perspective or aerial perspective. And so I wanted to show you some photographic, because I got a couple of emails about it, a couple of photographic examples. And then we'll get into some traditional media, and we'll finish with a little marker sketch applying what we see in these photographs. So when I look at this photograph, this is a San Francisco Bay, that's Alcatraz out there. What I notice is that things that are here in the foreground are very, very dark, and at the same time very, very light. So we have our extremes. We have extreme dark and we have extreme light. And then as I get further away, there's more and more of this atmosphere that we can see out over here above the horizon. So that atmosphere is between us, right, and the object that we're seeing in the distance. So if we look down this street right here, we can see that street going off towards the bay. If you look carefully, you'll see that you can still see all the shapes and forms, and you can still see volumes, because there's light sides and dark sides, but it's the contrast between those. So if I was to sample over here, and I opened up my levels here, if I sampled over there, this part of the street might use these. This is a black, so this is the levels palette, and this is black, this is your mid value gray, so it's like a value 5, and then this is a value 0. In some photography it's the exact opposite. This is called 0 because there's no light, and then there's full light, which is 10. But in pigment and markers, the way they're numbered, they tend to go the opposite. Black is 10 and 0 is white. So those are your values. So if we looked over to that area, we might see that uses a value scale somewhere in the middle, right? And then as we get here into the foreground, we'd use a value range of like all the way from 10 to 0. So as we just get further and further away, these two sort of slide. Well, it doesn't slide, sorry. You don't move the white point down. You just have less of the value available. So this might use, those hills out there might use, let's look at like a 3, no, sorry, a 5 or 6, and look at the shadow side, almost the same. So try to find a little light spot, dark spot. You see there's like a 1 value step of value change. And here as it gets closer, it gets a little darker. And if we go from that little island over here to Alcatraz and pick the darkest dark, you see that it gets even darker. And if I find the darkest dark down here in this alley, right, compared to this. And so you see each time I get closer, and if we look at the brightest bright, okay, it's brightest bright there. And if I look at the brightest bright on Alcatraz, okay, which is probably that building or that cliffside, you can still see it's like a value 5 as compared to 0. So I have quite a few bright values up here in the foreground. I also have some super, super darks. So that's basically it. You just have to add atmosphere. And as you add atmosphere, right, things that are further away become lower in color saturation and lower in contrast. So all the same forms can still read. I can still see boxes, right, buildings. I can still see those building boxes out on Alcatraz. I can also see them down over here in the alley and over here on tops of these building tops. But then I can also see them here in the foreground. Okay, but the ones in the foreground have much more contrast. So that's the easiest way to make your environment sketches look more three-dimensional, is to add atmosphere. So let's get rid of that one. Let's look at one more. Look at these rocks. It's up in Mendocino, and you can see the rocks here in the foreground, and then just the rocks that are even still probably maybe only 80 meters behind this rock face, right? And you can see the edge actually right here, right there, and then there. And you look at these rocks, right? That's probably only 40-50 meters behind this. But look at the shadow value here, super dark. Look at it there, a little bit less. Then look at it here on the cliffside, even less. And then if we went over here to this cliff, way in the distance, it'd be even less. And then down over here, even less, right? But if I got my car, went back up to the road, drove over there and walked down to the cliffs, this little spot way over here those cliffs would have the same value structure as the foreground when I'm standing over there. And when I look back this direction, it would have this value structure. So it's just because of the atmosphere, and here there's a lot of nice atmosphere because of the mist coming in from the waves hitting when it hits the rocks. And that mist is filling in behind this little rock wall here, and you can see how it moves this entire rock feature behind this one in the foreground, only because of the atmospheric perspective. Well, I shouldn't say only. It's in addition to overlapping, which is called occlusion, right, and the fact that it's smaller than this series of rocks, which is called perspective. But in this case, in this tutorial, we're just trying to focus on atmospheric perspective. Let's get rid of that one. Okay, this is the illustration that I did for the How to Draw book, and in fact, this might be the video that links to this illustration. So what I did here was apply, and I'm going to redo this sketch in a moment. And so what I tried to do was just apply the same idea, which was start way in the distance, right? Everything way back over there, those little rock formations. Okay, they're overlapping, and we have perspective, right? They're smaller in the distance, larger in the foreground. But I tried to keep the values very, very light. And so this is like an overcast day, dark rock formations. This could be snow, could be sand, water, I don't know. But the whole idea here is I want to have a lot of atmosphere. I want to try to establish depth and only play with those three things: perspective, occlusion, and atmospheric perspective. So in this case, if you notice, it's kind of like setting up, kind of like curtains in a way. And you could have like 5 different layers. So there's like, say, layer 1 back there. Then let's see, we pick out a little bit of value. There's kind of some shapes there, but it's pretty close, and that's like layer 1.5. Then here, that's the next layer, 2, 2, 2, and then the next on top of that, 3, 3, 3, and these could also be your marker numbers, right? And then here's a 4, 4, 5, 4, and maybe a 4 there. And then we go all the way into the foreground. There's level 6, 6, 6, and maybe 7. So I have sort of like 7 different value steps for this big rock field to get all of those things to overlap and to establish depth only based on value, not using line weight, only using shapes. And so that's what I want to try and do this week. Let's say you have a marker sketch and you're using like a Pilot Hi-Tech C pen or something, and you know it's unforgiving. It doesn't allow you to change the value as you sketch lighter or as you sketch further away in the distance. Unlike a graphite pencil or a ballpoint pen, you could sketch lightly out here on the horizon, and with this sort of pen you can't. But they're fun to still use, of course, because they're fast, they're efficient, and it just makes it a little tougher to show atmospheric perspective. So you have to go really dark with your markers after you do your line sketch. But if you want to add a little bit of atmosphere quickly in Photoshop after the fact, it's just really, I think I have 1 layer here, 2 layers. So I cleaned up the sky a little bit to make my silhouetted shapes in the foreground pop a bit more. And then I added just 1 layer of atmosphere. In this case, it's a really smoggy city. But as you can see, without a lot of effort, just like those seaside rocks, I've got my cityscape stuff, and maybe there's some like interesting huge mountain shapes, like Monument Valley kind of stuff back there, and then a hill, and then those guys pop just in front a little bit, and then this structure back here, which is kind of like this one, right, a little landing dock thing, that sits behind just because I added a lot of atmosphere, right, all through here. And then you just erase it out. You can just erase out this shape, and that makes this sit in front of that using value. And then this is closer to us than this one, right, which is down below, and then this one's even further away. And then these guys are even closer, and so this gets the darkest values. And then if I was to finish rendering this, I'd also bring in some of the brightest brights in here, so let the sun shine through, pick up a couple little highlights here and there. Definitely on the ship and this character, those will be my focal point, And that's where I would really pop the sort of get the brightest brights, the reflections of the sun on that ship. And then all the rest, once you establish your value scale, like say you paint that building back there with a little atmosphere, once you establish it, that's what you use to start painting over the top. So once you establish, you say, okay, well, there's my new value. All the shadow sides of the buildings are going to be this. Okay, and the light sides are going to be that. So just like those box shapes we saw it on Alcatraz, let's clean up some of those silhouettes. And you can see that I can start to come through here and then use that hill as my value change. And you can start to refine, but I'm using the value scale that I established by adding my atmosphere. A different value scale than here. Right, this is a much larger one. This is a compressed scale, but you can still show all the form. If you want to keep it far, far away, you can't go in there and punch up the contrast, otherwise it's going to pop and come very close to us. So now let's jump over to, oh, I got one more. This was a piece from Concept Design. I can't remember, one or two. Anyway, I tried to apply the same thinking here. So I'm adding a bit of steam to separate this like escalator from this little command center that's poking out, this little balcony. And then if we look here, same concept with the marker sketching. I've got things way in the distance, right? Way back over there. Maybe some orange here. So way back over there, you can see some other buildings through those holes. And so those have to be a compressed value scale. Then I can use a little bit more on those, a little more here. Right, then these buildings more because they're in front of those, and then this is in front of this, right? So overlaps, right? And then this whole thing also is closer. It's about the same distance as the balcony. Same looking down into this structure. This is like just like the marker sketch, but see how I can separate all of this. This element here can be separated, okay, from this background element just by adding a little bit of atmosphere. You could almost paint it like this first and then just come back with a big soft airbrush and add your atmosphere. Here you could add it a little bit more from the foreground to the background if this was getting tighter. It's not really that tight way in the distance, but we're quite zoomed in there. Anyway, that's the concept. So now let's jump over to my sketch table and take you through the sketching steps with markers to establish your atmospheric perspective and your values to do a little quick sketch. So if you're going to start a little sketch and you know you're going to do an environment and you want to add a lot of atmosphere and get a lot of depth in your quick sketch, this is the way to start. So what I like to do, I'm just working on a marker paper here with Copic markers, and I've grabbed like cool markers, full set. So I'm going to use, I think I started here with a C1, actually probably a C2 because the shows up a little better on the video. If I was doing a marker sketch just for myself, I'd probably start with C1 because your naked eye can see it a little bit better than my camera can. But the idea is to start very, very light. And I'm starting way in the distance first. I establish my horizon line. And I know that I'm just going to play with the three things. I'm going to play with perspective, which is basically that things are further away or smaller, things that are closer to us are larger. And I'm going to play with overlapping, also known as occlusion. So I'm going to set some of those shapes overlapping each other. And most importantly, and the focus of this sketch exercise is going to be atmospheric perspective. And all I'm starting to do is just imagine this kind of rolling hills and coming towards us into the foreground, and we've got these kind of lumpy rock shapes poking up out of the ground. And they're a darker material maybe than the ground. Soft lighting, overcast day, so not a lot of direct lighting that I have to worry about rendering the form of the rocks. And so I just work with a light marker and sort of block out the scene first, maybe a big puddle here in the foreground. And start blocking it in, get the rough shapes, and then progressively grab darker and darker markers and try not to go over everything. And just as I pick a new marker, this was like a C3 probably, and I didn't go all the way to the horizon, right? And see, I grab like a 4 now, and I'll go about halfway back, for instance. The discipline is to, as you have a marker, it's easy to go back in and just start hitting everything, and then it flattens it out. So what you want to try and do is just imagine, pick a spot, into the perspective, and say, okay, at this depth, I'm going to only use marker number 4, okay, for the rocks. And then I can do everything in the foreground can be also number 4 for the dark rocks, right? Because they're going to get darker and darker and darker, because markers only go one way, right, which is darker. So then here I've grabbed a 5, and so I'm saying, okay, these foreground rocks, I know these are going to be the darkest, right? And the idea is that these are all dark gray or almost black rocks with atmosphere thrown in to give us our depth. And so I'm just blocking out little shapes, hinting at a ground plane there. So I've just got these sort of lumpy looking rock forms. And I took a 5 all the way, and see, if I made that a value 5, that pulled it off the value number 4 level, brought it towards us. And so I stretched the bottom down a little bit to bring it a little bit more into the foreground. This is a 6. And I think this was a total of maybe 9 minutes, and this is playing at about 150% speed, which makes it only about a 6-minute clip. So we're almost at the end of this little tutorial on atmospheric perspective. And so you just keep going darker and darker into the foreground. Now what you would do is you would block this out first, then you could think about your lighting, okay, and say, okay, well, I'm going to now I'm going to open up the clouds and bring the light in from the, upper left, for instance, and I'm going to use now the value range that I've established, and I'm going to push the shadows even darker and try to now make the forms read. I'm not really worried much about making the forms read. You'll see I am, instead of just making this look like cut out pieces of paper for each rock shape, I am leaving a couple of areas with a little bit of lighter gray, which starts to hint a little bit of volume, but it's not really my focus. Just trying to mix it up so there's a little bit of variety and texture to the rocks. So you could bring in the light, and then you would start to go in and model each one of these rocks using the value scale that you've established. You would bring in some light, probably with probably like a white Prismacolor pencil, and you could also then intensify your shadows. You could start to cast some shadows on the ground plane, and that would kind of be the next step. Or you could stay with this kind of overcast day and build it out that way. So this is very much the process I did for that first sketch I showed from our How to Draw book. And so I'm doing this as one of my free tutorial Fridays, but it's very likely that it will be the tutorial that we link to out of that book. That book's going to have 26 hard-linked tutorials, some of which are on my YouTube channel, others of which are going to be all new and will not be on my YouTube channel, but will be hidden, and you'll access them through linking from the book. So it's going to be a mixture of those, but we're pretty excited about that technology in our app and seeing how you like it. I think it's going to make the book very unique. So I'm going back now and refining. As the markers dry, they get a little bit lighter. So you got to go back and just keep finessing. And so it's this idea of just always kind of pushing and pulling those rocks in and out of space, right? I know as I add more contrast, they're going to come forward. If I can leave them light, they're going to go further away. So here I grab back to that C1 and I start trying to do some very, very distant hills and some very, very small rocks to intensify this concept of perspective, right? And the impression of perspective of having some very, very small rocks way off in the distance. And that makes my rocks in the foreground look even closer. So we're almost done. So thanks for the email questions. A couple of you had. Also, thanks a lot for the comments on the YouTube channel. Glad you've been enjoying it. I'm going to pretty much be trying to stick with a lot of traditional media for the next month or so as we wrap up our tutorials for the How to Draw book. So we're still recording a few of those, and that'll keep me in the traditional mode for probably the next month or so. So hope you enjoyed it, and please come back next week and tell your friends. Have a great week.